A lot of you have been asking me to weigh in on this debate between Thunderfoot and the Amazing Atheist on one side, and a user called How the World Works on the other. I haven't seen much of How the World Works or his videos, and telling you the truth, I have very little interest in watching them. I also don't have much interest in this debate, and nor do I have a horse in this race. And if I did, it'd be Thunderfoot, so there's my bias there. But since you've been asking my opinion, I thought I'd weigh in, not on one person versus another, but just on some of the facts that have been presented. And so for this first video, let's look at the Thunderfoot video.
Not one civilization in the history of the world with de jure private property rights and rule of law has ever experienced a famine.
All right, let me just break in here to say that this is an incredibly stupid thing to say, just because of how absolute it is. If he had said something like, societies with private property rights and the rule of law are less likely to experience famines, or are better equipped to deal with famines, or tend to experience famines less severely, I could get on board with it. As it is, I'm forced to agree with Thunderfoot's evaluations of his intellect and character. So in no way should anything in this video or the one that follows be considered to be a defense of how the world works or anything he says.
Scroll the clock back to the time before the joys of modern agriculture, when famines were more common. If the crops fail for a couple of years, you're shit out of luck. It doesn't matter if you're George Washington, Karl Marx, or King Canute.
Well, here's something that's difficult to see. Thunderfoot's statement is just as absolutist as how the world works is. These different societies did not experience famines equally. Now there's a problem with comparing economic conditions, which is what we're doing, between different cultures. It's a lot better if you can follow a single culture over a short period of time and see the effect that changes have. In 1620, the Mayflower famously landed on the shores of the New World, and its members established Plymouth Plantation. They spent the first 3 years nearly starving as terrible droughts ruined their crops. Then, in 1623, things turned around, and they had plenty to eat, leading to a harvest festival that we now call the first Thanksgiving. But here's the thing, the droughts didn't stop in 1623. They continued on for another few years. In fact, the drought of 1623 was most likely the worst one. So what was it that rescued them from famine? Let's get the information from the horse's mouth, Governor William Bradford, and his history, known as Of Plymouth Plantation, taken from his journal. In famine years, crops were considered common property. The fruits of everyone's labor went into a common stock, from which colony members could take whatever they needed. Governor Bradford wrote, "For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children, without any recompense. The strong, or man of parts, had no more in division of victuals and clothes than he that was weak and not able to do a quarter the other could. This was thought injustice. Upon the point all being to have alike and to do alike, they thought themselves in the like condition, and of as good as another. And so, if it did not cut of those relations that God had set amongst men, yet it did at least much diminish and take of the mutual respects that should be preserved amongst them." In the spring of 1623, they decided to change the policy. At length, after much debate of things, the governor, with the advice of the chiefest amongst them, gave way that they should set corve every man for his own particular, and in that regard trust to themselves. In all other things go on in the general way as before. This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means the governor or any other could use, and saved him a great deal of trouble, and gave far better content. The women now went willingly into the field, and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability, whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression. The only change made to the policy was property rights. Let people keep what they grew for themselves. In the span of a year, under continuing drought conditions, they went from famine to plenty. It's clear that if eliminating famine is your goal, then it's far better to do it with property rights than without.
The free market only cares about what makes money. All other concerns are secondary.
See the imagery he's using here? He's trying to propagate the myth of slavery as being the result of the free market. But slavery existed long before the free market did in totalitarian governments all the way back through history. In fact, the history of slavery in America shows the government had to keep shoring up the ability of slave owners to keep slaves as the free market kept making it less and less profitable. The economic advantage to owning a slave is that it's cheaper than hiring a worker. But the free market continued to make labor more and more efficient so that the cost to the employer of a job that paid the same wages was lower. Once the costs of an employee become less than a slave, slavery goes away. By far the biggest cost of slavery is runaways. Most slave owners did not have the resources to track a runaway very far. Once word got out of a successful runaway, others became more daring and started running in a mass exodus. This is similar to how the Berlin Wall finally fell, although that was of course on a much larger scale. This was the biggest reason for the torture and mistreatment of slaves. Slaves who attempted to run away or dissent were tortured or beaten in front of the others in an attempt to make an example and discourage the other slaves from doing the same thing. The acts of government that were made to stop it existed from the very start of the country. Thomas Jefferson and George Washington are vilified as hypocrites for speaking out against slavery while keeping slaves of their own, but the truth is, these very laws made it difficult for them to free their slaves. For example, if any slave hereafter emancipated shall remain in this Commonwealth more than 12 months after his or her right to freedom shall have accrued, he or she shall forfeit all such right and may be apprehended and sold. George Washington took advantage of a loophole in the laws to free his slaves at the last possible moment he could, in his will. By the time Jefferson had died, this loophole had been closed. It grew worse as the 19th century proceeded towards civil war. Fugitive slave laws meant that the expense of retrieving runaway slaves was shifted from the slave owner to the state. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 made it clear that not even a freed slave had the right to claim the constitutional right of habeas corpus, and were quite often denied the opportunity to present proof of their freedom in court. Escaped slaves, even ones that had made it to a free state, could be caught, brought before a magistrate, and taken back in chains, and this was also true of freed slaves. As the abolitionist movement grew, juries in free states started using their right of nullification to find the former slave not guilty. Federal marshals started refusing to enforce the law. It even got to the point where authorities trying to remove and return the escapee received armed opposition. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed. Federal marshals could now be charged with fines for refusing to arrest suspected runaways. They were required to act under nothing more than the claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. Suspected slaves were denied their rights to a jury trial and to testify, and it stiffened penalties for any free person helping a slave to escape. Even as the Civil War raged on, U.S. Marshals continued capturing runaway slaves and returning them to their masters in chains. The free market tried to free slaves. It had made slave ownership so expensive that the slaves were the exclusive province of the rich. According to census figures, 75% of Southern families owned no slaves at all. When government prevented the cost from rising further, many people acted in every way they could to stop them. The free market had worked to make slavery financially inviable, and it was only the actions of government that propagated it. The free market most certainly did not make it profitable. In the next video, I'll give my thoughts to the contributions of the amazing atheist to this debate.